I've spent the last 3 days delving into the science of how smartphone usage is affecting our brains, and yours is literally getting smaller right now. But before you start running to the hospital, I'll tell you why that's the case and show you the key steps to stop and even revert the negative effects of your phone addiction. So first, let's talk about changes in brain structure and function. Studies suggest that excessive smartphone usage, especially related to internet addiction, can lead to reduced amounts of gray matter in your brain, especially in the areas related to emotional regulation, decision making, and impulse control. And for those of you who don't know, gray matter is one of the two main types of matter in our brain. And if the amount of gray matter related to those activities is reducing in your brain, that means that you are going to get worse at those activities like impulse control and decision making. Additionally, studies also suggest that chronic exposure to our screens and other digital stimuli can change the way that our brain processes information. So potentially, this would mean long-term changes in literally the way your brain is wired in relation to focus and decision making. Possibly because of this, increased screen time in children and adolescents has been correlated with a higher risk of developing symptoms of ADHD, such as inattention, impulsivity, and hyperactivity. And all of that is pretty scary already. But now let's move on to memory. And to explain this next point, I need to tell you about taxi drivers. You see, back in the day, before smartphones and GPS navigation was a thing, taxi drivers had to memorize street locations and how to get to different places in their city without the use of any external devices to constantly remind them of where those places were. As a result of this, taxi drivers generally had bigger hippocampuses than the average person. And for those of you who don't know, the hippocampus is the brain region that is associated with memory and anything related to that. But you see, after smartphones became a thing, taxi drivers no longer had to use their memory as much, and therefore, their hippocampuses slowly started decreasing in size. But this does not only apply to taxi drivers. All of us use our smartphones as an external memory device in some way or another. And this in turn impairs our ability to retain and recall information. Scientists have called this effect digital amnesia. And since we're on the topic of memory, let's go back to gray matter. You see, when the amount of gray matter you have in your brain is reduced, this is associated with higher risks of depression and dementia. And for example, something like Alzheimer's, which is a type of dementia, is one of the top 10 causes of death worldwide. So in an indirect but very real way, our smartphones are increasing our risk of things like Alzheimer's, which I, for one, don't want to get. Next, let's talk about multitasking. We tend to multitask a lot using our phones. This includes things like checking your phone mid-conversation or looking at your phone while watching TV. Any of these or anything related to that counts as multitasking using your phone. And most likely, all of us have done it at some point, and if not at some point, we're probably doing it every single day. And what's wrong with this, you might be asking? Well, studies find that consistently multitasking with your phone can hinder our ability to think deep and complex thoughts. And multitasking can create a false sense of urgency, which stops our brains from putting information into long-term storage. And just to continue down the never-ending list of the side effects and consequences of multitasking on your phone, it also overloads your working memory, which reduces your ability to do problem solving and critical thinking. And if all of that was not enough, it also increases our distractibility and lowers our attention spans. So I think we've said enough about that, and now let's move on to talking about sleep. So you might be asking, how does phone usage affect our sleep? Well, there's two main ways. First of all, phones emit blue light, which, if you view blue light at nighttime, that disrupts our circadian rhythm. Basically, when your eyes see that blue light, they think, oh look, it's daytime, let me be awake. And then your body doesn't want to sleep. It's a bit of an oversimplification, but that's how it is. So looking at your phone late at night will reduce your sleep quality. And also, your phones might be reducing the total amount of sleep time you're getting. Not just because of the blue light, but because a lot of people use their phones to procrastinate going to bed. And even if that's not the intention, sometimes you'll be going to bed and then you'll look at a notification on your phone, and then suddenly you get caught up in a cycle of scrolling, and 30 minutes later, you're like, shoot, I'm late, it's 30 minutes past my bedtime. And although you might be like, oh, I knew that, like, this doesn't really matter that much, it's nothing revolutionary, like, it does happen. Don't lie to yourself, you've probably gone to bed late before because you were looking at your phone. And I don't even think I have to list all of the terrible things that happens if you miss out on good sleep. Like, I can go down the list of, oh, it impairs brain function, reduces emotional stability, like, it worsens every function that your body has, including your brain, and sleep's important. I don't really need to tell you all about that. So instead, let's move on to mental health, where unsurprisingly, social media and smartphone usage is highly linked with depression, stress, and anxiety. Basically, just the way social media is designed and the internet to keep you always hooked in, and the way social media is always making you compare yourself with others, which is making you insecure, and FOMO, and sometimes cyberbullying, just the list goes on. But the moral of the story is that social media and the internet is generally really bad for your mental health, and thankfully this has become common knowledge in recent years. But something that is less well known is your smartphone's impact on your social intelligence. Constant engagement with smartphones has been linked to lower social and emotional intelligence. It diminishes real-life communication skills, empathy, and the ability to pick up on nonverbal cues during conversations. Not to mention that constantly being glued to your phone is not very good for your social life either, because it likely means you're spending a lot of time inside when you could be spending time socializing and having friends. Although all of that is separate and additional to all of the negative effects I mentioned earlier. So if you want to increase your social and emotional intelligence and you need one tip to do that right away, reduce your screen time. Next, let's talk about the smartphone's impact on your cognitive function. I want to bring up a study where two groups of people had to read the exact same text, but the only difference was one group read that text on a screen and the other group read it on paper. Somehow, even though it was the exact same text, the group that read it on a screen had lower comprehension rates. This shows that just the presence of a screen, even if it's the exact same activity, that's going to lower your comprehension rates. A little bit more insight into how and why becomes more clear with another study, where two groups of people were taking the exact same test. This time, the only difference was one group had their phone next to them on the desk and the other didn't. Now, it's important to note that the group that had their phone on the desk had the phones face down so they couldn't see the screen, and it was on silent mode, it was on do not disturb, so no notifications were distracting them. All it was the physical object, the phone, being on the table. Yet somehow, just the presence of the phone was able to reduce the test taker's score by a significant amount. The reason for this is an effect that scientists call brain drain. Basically, the way smartphones are designed is to fill up the limited amount of cognitive capability you have in your mind. I bet that's not the exact technical term for it, but basically you have only a limited amount of thinking power in your brain at once. Just using logic, you can understand that if you're using, let's say, half of that brain capacity to think about one thing, you're not going to have the full ability to think about another thing until you stop thinking about the thing that's taking up the other half of the brain capacity. Basically, what I'm trying to get at here is you have a limited amount of brain capacity that you can use at once, and the way phones are designed is to fill up that mental capacity meter even if you're not actively using them. And as if everything I've said throughout this entire video isn't bad enough, all of these effects are way worse for developing minds, which means anyone younger than their mid to late 20s. So if that's you, and even if that's not you, this all sounds pretty terrible, because it is. There's no sugarcoating it. Smartphones have these terrible effects on us, and I didn't know how terrible they were either until I started doing all this research and I discovered the things that I'm now telling you through this video. And I want to say that a lot of this stuff is not your fault. It's the fault of the companies making these apps and these phones and designing them specifically to drain your attention span, your cognitive capacity, just so they can get more money and get you to spend more time on their apps. And if you think about it, that's pretty selfish on their part because they're destroying the brains of anybody who uses a smartphone, which is, well, basically everybody. And yes, there are ways to stop and sometimes even revert the negative consequences that phones have on our brains. So I decided that I wanted to make a part 2 to this video where I go through all of these things, but instead show you the solutions and the actionable steps you can take to fix those things. So if that video is out, it'll probably be here or linked in the description or pinned comment and you can watch it right now. If it's not out though, I do have another free resource that you can use. You see, recently I launched a free course about productivity, and if you just want to double your productivity in less than an hour's worth of content using the most actionable and results guaranteed tips that I know, well then that should be the first link in the description. So you can click on it right now. It's just a free course with a bunch of valuable information. So even if you're feeling hesitant, like, it's free value. Just go there, you can't possibly regret it. And again, I'm not really selling you anything because it's just a free resource to help you achieve mental mastery. And that's what this channel is about, learning to master our minds and achieve mental mastery in the modern world that is basically a minefield for our brains. If that sounds interesting, well, I'll see you next time, and hopefully you'll consider subscribing.